For most of Earth's history, the land was empty. No forests, no soil, no shade, just bare rock stretching across continents beneath a dimmer sun, while the oceans teemed with life. Reef systems larger than anything alive today, armored fish, early sharks, entire ecosystems rising and collapsing beneath waves that had never once touched a tree. And then something grew. Not a flower, not grass, something stranger, an organism unlike anything that had stood on land before, with roots deep enough to reach rock that had not been touched in billions of years, and wood hard enough to hold itself upright against gravity for the first time in the history of life on land. Within a few million years of its arrival, roughly three-quarters of all species on Earth were dead. Not from an asteroid, not from a volcanic eruption, not from any catastrophe arriving from outside the planet, from a tree, simply by growing. What those first forests did to this planet, to its oceans, to its atmosphere, to the climate, set off a chain of consequences so extreme and so far reaching that the world on the other side of it barely resembled the one that existed before. And the strangest part is that buried inside that catastrophe may be the reason complex life on land survived at all. In today's story, we go back to a world before forest existed and follow what happened the moment they arrived. But before we do, if deep time and the events that quietly reshaped this planet are why you watch, subscribe, and leave a like, it helps this reach someone else who would want to find it. Now relax and let's go back to the world before trees were born, long before forests darkened the continents, before leaves moved in the wind, or roots fractured stone beneath the ground. The surface of Earth carried a strange stillness across its land. The planet itself was already ancient beyond comprehension, approximately 4.5 billion years old. Yet trees had not arrived for nearly 90% of that history. For most of geological time, no trunk had ever risen toward the sky. No branch had cast a shadow across soil, because soil itself did not yet truly exist. The world of this chapter belongs to the Devonian period, spanning from roughly 419 to 359 million years ago. Its name came from Devon in southwestern England, where paleontologists first studied the distinctive rock layers preserving this vanished age. Seen from orbit, the Devonian Earth would have appeared familiar in outline, yet profoundly alien in texture, with continents barren across immense distances, colored in ochres, reds, and grays beneath a warmer atmosphere rich in greenhouse gases. Across those empty expanses, life held only a fragile grip. Thin mats of moss and lichen clung close to damp riverbanks and seasonal streams, hugging the surface in low patches no taller than a thumb. Nothing rose above knee height. Nothing possessed wood, bark, or a canopy. The shallow anchoring structures of early plants barely entered the uppermost centimeters of fractured mineral crust. Beneath them lay powdered rock, dry sediment, and exposed stone untouched by deep biology. What modern life recognizes as soil had not yet formed. There was no dark layer of decaying organic matter, no web of roots, fungi, insects, and bacteria mixing together beneath the surface. The continents remained geologically naked, weathered mostly by wind, rain, and temperature alone. Rivers carried grit and dissolved minerals toward the sea, but slowly, with little interference from life above them. The oceans, meanwhile, had become astonishingly complex. The Devonian is often called the Age of Fishes because marine ecosystems expanded into forms both beautiful and monstrous. Jawless fish drifted through coastal waters beside the first true sharks. Armored placoderms, some reaching nearly 9 meters in length, moved through reef systems larger than any coral structures alive today. Vast stromatoporoid reefs stretched across shallow seas in dense labyrinths of limestone and living tissue, supporting ecosystems layered with predators, scavengers, and filter feeders. Above this thriving ocean world hung an atmosphere unlike the modern sky. Carbon dioxide concentrations were estimated at 8 to 10 times higher than pre industrial levels, trapping heat across the planet and sustaining humid greenhouse conditions from equator to pole. Oxygen remains significantly lower than today, around 15% of the atmosphere rather than 21%. That difference shaped everything. Air with less oxygen limited how large and active organisms could become on land, where breathing and water retention posed constant challenges. The emptiness of the continents was not evidence that life had failed there. Life had already approached the shoreline many times. What it lacked were the biological tools capable of turning bare stone into a living landscape. Somewhere within the slow experimentation of evolution, two of those tools were beginning to emerge together, inside the same organism, for the first time in Earth's history. For hundreds of millions of years, the edge of the continents remained low and quiet. Early plants spread thinly across damp surfaces, pressed close against stone by gravity and dryness, unable to rise into open air. Their tissues were soft, almost gelatinous, sustained only by the delicate upward pull of water through microscopic spaces inside their cells. Beyond a certain height, the weight of their own bodies became impossible to support. Life on land remained flattened against the ground, as though the planet itself were holding it there. Then evolution assembled a molecule unlike anything biology had produced before. It was built from carbon, arranged into long, irregular chains, woven together in dense three-dimensional networks that resisted bending, tearing, and collapse. This molecule, lignin, hardened the walls surrounding plant cells until they behaved less like wet membranes and more like structural beams. For the first time, living tissue could remain upright under its own mass. Stems thickened. Vertical growth became possible. Sunlight that had once reached the ground uninterrupted could now be intercepted high above it. Lignin carried another unusual property within its tangled architecture. Most biological molecules repeat in orderly patterns, allowing enzymes to grip them and dismantle them piece by piece. Lignin formed differently. Its bonds crossed unpredictably through space, creating a chaotic rigidity that living chemistry struggled to break apart. Evolution had produced something closer to engineered material than soft tissue, an organic framework capable of withstanding pressure, wind, and time. Yet height alone solved very little. A tall organism required enormous quantities of water, lifted continuously upward against gravity. Without a deeper source of moisture and minerals, any plant rising above the surface would dry from within beneath the Devonian sun. At nearly the same moment, another transformation appeared. Beneath the ground, certain plants abandoned the simple hair like anchors of earlier species and began sending branching structures downward into fractures within the rock itself. These were true roots, not merely attachments, but active systems of exploration. Their tips divided repeatedly, penetrating sediment and mineral layers in search of hidden water reserves far below the surface. Fine root tissues absorbed dissolved nutrients directly from stone and transported them upward into the growing body above. The relationship between these two innovations was absolute. Wood without roots would topple and wither, unable to supply its upper tissues. Roots without wood could not justify their own depth, because no low creeping plant required such vast internal transport. Each invention depended completely upon the other. Together they formed a biological partnership so complex that Earth required hundreds of millions of years to produce it. Out of that long interval emerged a strange organism called Archaeopteris, its name meaning ancient wing, taken from the broad fronds spreading from its branches like layered feathers. It was not a modern tree in any familiar sense. Its closest relatives resembled giant fern like plants, and it reproduced not through seeds, but through drifting spores released into humid air. Its internal anatomy belonged partly to an older world, yet its overall form belonged unmistakably to the future. Archaeopteris possessed a woody trunk strengthened by lignin, a branching crown raised high above the ground, and roots capable of reaching deeply into untouched stone. Across the Devonian continents, it became the first organism to truly stand above the land rather than cling to it. From that quiet beginning, the balance between rock, water, atmosphere, and ocean began to change. In the fossil beds of what is now New York State, there are slabs of stone preserving the outlines of fronds pressed into ancient sediment, delicate branching patterns darkened by time. These remains come from the Catskill Formation, one of the quiet places where the first true forests left their signature behind. Around 385 million years ago, Archaeopteris emerged there beside winding Devonian rivers, and the shape of the continents began to change around it. It grew to heights previously unknown on land, rising as much as 30 meters into the warm air, roughly the height of a modern 10-story building. Its trunk thickened year after year with concentric layers of woody tissue, giving it the strength to remain upright through storms and seasonal flooding. Above that trunk spread broad crowns of flattened fronds, arranged to gather sunlight efficiently across wide surfaces. From a distance, their texture would not have resembled modern leaves exactly. The canopy likely appeared feathered and layered, dense enough to darken the ground beneath it, while still shifting softly in the humid Devonian winds. Archaeopteris spread with extraordinary speed across Euramerica, the supercontinent formed from what would later become North America, Greenland, and much of Western Europe. In geological terms, its expansion was nearly instantaneous. River floodplains that had remained open and exposed for billions of years became lined with dense stands of woody growth within only a few million years. Coastal lowlands transformed first, where water remained abundant and seasonal flooding deposited fresh sediment across broad valleys. Seen from high above, those early forests would have appeared as dark ribbons following the branching arteries of rivers inland. Green spread across the continents in connected waves, reaching farther each generation as spores drifted through moist air and settled across new ground. The color of the land itself changed. Red and ochre terrain disappeared beneath expanding canopies that intercepted sunlight before it could strike exposed stone. The arrival of shade altered the physical character of the surface almost immediately. Beneath the canopy, temperatures softened. Moisture lingered longer after rainfall. Pools and damp hollows persisted through dry intervals that once would have evaporated quickly beneath direct sun. Air movement slowed among the trunks, trapping humidity close to the ground and allowing entirely new microenvironments to emerge within the shelter of the forest floor. Even the local atmosphere responded. Forest canopies disrupted wind currents that had once moved uninterrupted across barren plains. Water vapor collected differently above wooded valleys, subtly changing precipitation patterns. Regions containing forests became more favorable for further forest growth, as though the organisms themselves were reshaping the climate around them into conditions that suited their own expansion. Each season, immense quantities of organic debris drifted downward from the canopy. Fronds, bark fragments, reproductive structures, and dead wood accumulated in soft layers along the ground. For the first time, the continents began gathering thick blankets of decaying biological matter. The earliest true soils formed slowly within that mixture of minerals and organic remains, darkening the surface beneath the trees. Far below, the roots of Archaeopteris continued their silent work. They extended several meters downward through sediment and fractured bedrock, spreading laterally through layers untouched by deep biology since the formation of the continents themselves. Stone that had rested unchanged for immense spans of time now encountered living tissue, pressing steadily into its cracks, carrying water, acids, and chemistry into the hidden world below the forest floor. Far beneath the quiet dimness of the Devonian forest floor, the most important work was happening out of sight. The roots of Archaeopteris moved slowly through cracks in buried stone, branching through sediment and fractured mineral layers with patient persistence. They did not simply force rock apart through pressure alone. Around every growing root tip, living cells released thin films of chemical compounds into the darkness, altering the geology around them molecule by molecule. Among those compounds were carbonic acid, oxalic acid, and citric acid, weak organic acids produced by ordinary biological processes, yet powerful over long spans of time. As water carried them across mineral surfaces, bonds within the rock began to loosen, crystals destabilized, tiny fragments dissolved into solution. What appeared solid and permanent from above became chemically vulnerable in contact with living tissue. Most continental crust consisted primarily of silicate rock, dense with minerals formed deep within Earth long before life spread across the land. Locked inside those minerals was phosphorus, scattered in microscopic quantities through the stone. Phosphorus carried an importance out of proportion to its rarity. Every strand of DNA required it to maintain its structure. Every living cell depended upon ATP, the molecule storing and transferring usable energy through metabolism, and ATP itself relied upon phosphorus at its core. The membranes surrounding cells also depended upon phosphorus rich phospholipids. Without it, growth halted. Life could not expand beyond severe biological limits. Before deep rooted forests appeared, phosphorus entered rivers only gradually. Wind eroded exposed surfaces grain by grain. Rain loosened sediment from bare terrain and carried dissolved minerals toward the sea through shallow runoff. The process was slow, diffused, and largely restricted to the uppermost surface of the continents. Oceans evolved within that limited nutrient supply for immense spans of time. The roots of Archaeopteris changed the pathway completely. Instead of waiting for erosion to expose fresh minerals, the trees penetrated directly into buried rock layers and weathered them from within. Entire networks of roots interacted continuously with stone across floodplains, valleys, and coastal lowlands, multiplying the area of chemical contact far beyond anything previous ecosystems had produced. Geochemical reconstructions suggest that phosphorus delivery into the global ocean increased by approximately an order of magnitude after the spread of deep rooted trees. Rivers carried nearly 10 times more dissolved nutrients than before, not briefly but continuously across millions of years. Waterways draining forested landscapes became chemically transformed systems, dense with suspended particles and mineral rich runoff washing seaward after seasonal rains. Near the mouths of those rivers, the water itself likely changed color. Fine sediment clouded the shallows in muted browns and pale greens. Dissolved nutrients accumulated in concentrations no marine ecosystem had previously encountered. Estuaries thickened with organic material drifting outward from the continents, spreading slowly into warm coastal seas already rich with life. The oceans had not evolved safeguards against such abundance. For hundreds of millions of years, marine systems had adapted to relative scarcity, where biological productivity remained constrained by the slow release of nutrients from stone. Now the balance shifted rapidly. Every major river flowing from the new forests carried a continuous chemical pulse outward into shallow seas, delivering the ingredients for biological expansion at a scale the Devonian world had never experienced before. In calm coastal waters beneath the humid sky, that nutrient flood began feeding growth faster than existing ecosystems could absorb or regulate. Along the shallow continental shelves of the Devonian world, the sea began changing color. Rivers descending from the new forests carried dissolved minerals and suspended nutrients outward into warm coastal water, where sunlight still reached easily through the upper layers of the ocean. Cyanobacteria and microscopic algae absorbed that nutrient influx immediately. Their populations expanded into immense blooms, stretching across bays, estuaries, and inland seas in drifting sheets visible from enormous distances. This process is known today as eutrophication. When excess nutrients enter water, microscopic photosynthetic organisms reproduce far faster than surrounding ecosystems can regulate. For a brief period, productivity surges. The surface ocean thickens with living cells gathering light and consuming phosphorus in extraordinary quantities. Yet the expansion contains its own collapse. Once the available nutrients are exhausted, the bloom dies almost all at once. Trillions of dead organisms begin sinking slowly into darker water below. Bacteria feeding upon the remains multiply rapidly around them, decomposing the organic matter particle by particle. That decomposition consumes dissolved oxygen from the surrounding seawater. In ordinary conditions, waves and circulation restore oxygen continuously from the atmosphere above. During a bloom of sufficient scale, however, bacterial demand rises beyond what circulation can replenish. Oxygen concentrations begin falling across entire regions of ocean. The result is anoxia, water so depleted of oxygen that most complex marine life can no longer survive within it. Fish suffocate in place. Slow-moving bottom dwellers disappear first, followed by reef organisms unable to escape the expanding dead zones. Entire ecosystems that evolved over tens of millions of years begin collapsing beneath a surface that still appears calm from above. The visual transformation would have been striking. Coastal waters turned vivid green during the height of the blooms, then shifted toward brown as vast quantities of algae died and decayed. In stagnant shallows, the sea darkened further toward black, stained by decomposing organic material suspended through the water column. The upper layer became chemically separated from the deeper ocean beneath it, preventing oxygen-rich surface water from circulating downward. Beneath those darkened seas stood the immense stromatoporoid reefs of the Devonian, reef systems larger than most modern coral structures. For ages, they had formed intricate underwater cities of limestone and living tissue across continental shelves. Now, sunlight reaching them diminished beneath opaque bloom waters. Oxygen levels dropped around the colonies. Individual reef sections died gradually, leaving pale skeletal frameworks behind, while neighboring sections weakened beside them. On a geological timescale, the disappearance was devastatingly fast. The evidence remains preserved in stone. Black shale deposits formed beneath oxygen-starved water, where organic matter accumulated faster than scavengers or bacteria could fully consume it. These dark sedimentary layers appear across ancient coastlines in North America, Europe, North Africa, and Australia, recording a synchronized planetary crisis written quietly into the rock record. Within the stagnant water, heat also became trapped. Normal circulation patterns weakened, allowing coastal dead zones to warm further beneath the Devonian sun. Warmer water held even less dissolved oxygen, tightening the crisis in slow feedback loops, spreading across the continental seas. While marine ecosystems struggled below the surface, another transformation had already begun unfolding above the forests, inside the atmosphere itself. The balance between ocean, air, and forest was shifting. High above the Devonian forests, an invisible exchange was unfolding continuously between leaf, air, and sunlight. Every frond of Archaeopteris absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and used solar energy to split water molecules apart, building carbon into sugars, fibers, and woody tissue. Over the lifespan of a single large tree, hundreds of kilograms of carbon could become locked inside its trunk, branches, and roots. In the late Devonian world, that carbon rarely returned to the atmosphere after the tree died. Across millions of square kilometers of expanding forest, the effect accumulated slowly but relentlessly. Generation after generation of Archaeopteris continued drawing carbon dioxide downward from the sky and incorporating it into living tissue at a scale Earth had never experienced before. The atmosphere entering the Devonian had remained warm and greenhouse heavy for immense stretches of geological time, with carbon dioxide concentrations roughly 8 to 10 times higher than pre-industrial levels. Thick atmospheric carbon helped stabilize global temperatures across the planet, maintaining humid conditions even near the poles. The forests altered that balance. Ancient isotope signatures, preserved within paleosols and sedimentary rocks, reveal a substantial decline in atmospheric carbon dioxide through the late Devonian. Some geochemical reconstructions suggest concentrations may have fallen by as much as 50 to 80% from earlier peaks within only a few million years, a rapid transformation by geological standards. As carbon dioxide declined, the greenhouse effect weakened with it. Global temperatures began falling gradually across oceans and continents alike. Regions near the poles, ice-free for most of the Devonian period, started accumulating permanent ice sheets along high-latitude landmasses. Bright surfaces of snow and ice reflected increasing amounts of incoming sunlight back into space rather than absorbing it into the planet below. Cooling, therefore, reinforced itself. Expanding ice reflected more sunlight, which lowered temperatures further, allowing still more ice to accumulate in a self-strengthening cycle. The oceans responded immediately to the changing climate. As larger quantities of water became trapped within continental ice sheets, global sea levels slowly retreated. Vast, shallow marine shelves that had once supported dense reef systems and complex coastal ecosystems emerged from beneath the waterline. Habitats that survived the spreading anoxic zones now contracted physically as shorelines advanced outward and inland seas diminished. Marine organisms adapted to warm, shallow environments found themselves compressed into shrinking ecological space. Reef communities, already weakened by oxygen loss, struggled against falling temperatures and disappearing continental shelves at the same time. The crisis no longer moved through the oceans along a single pathway. Nutrient flooding had destabilized marine chemistry from below, while atmospheric carbon removal altered planetary climate from above. Within the forests themselves, carbon continued accumulating silently in enormous quantities, stored in woody tissue that almost nothing in the Devonian world possessed the chemistry to decompose efficiently. The atmosphere thinned of carbon year after year, while the continents slowly filled with buried organic matter, and the imbalance between living growth and decay continued widening. across the slowly cooling Devonian world. Across the floor of the Devonian forests, fallen trunks began accumulating in silence. Storms brought some trees down beside riverbanks. Others collapsed slowly under their own age, settling into damp sediment beneath dense canopies. Yet after they fell, something unusual happened. The wood remained. Earlier forms of life had always returned quickly to the atmosphere after death. Soft tissues broke apart beneath microbial activity, releasing their stored carbon back into air and water within years or decades. The chemistry of decomposition had shaped Earth for billions of years, maintaining a rough balance between growth and decay. Lignified wood disrupted that balance completely. The reason lay inside the structure of lignin itself. Unlike cellulose, starch, or protein, lignin possessed no simple repeating arrangement for enzymes to attack systematically. Its carbon-rich framework twisted through irregular three-dimensional bonds, forming a molecular architecture so chaotic that decomposer organisms had never encountered anything comparable before. The bacteria and fungi of the Devonian world lacked the biochemical tools required to dismantle it efficiently. When an Archaeopteris tree died, its tissues resisted decay for immense spans of time. Bark remained intact. Trunks retained structural strength long after death. Entire fallen forests accumulated layer upon layer across floodplains and wetlands, creating thick deposits of undecomposed organic material. River channels buried some beneath fresh sediment during seasonal flooding. Coastal lowlands compressed others beneath accumulating mud and mineral debris. Over millions of years, pressure and heat transformed those buried forests into coal. The consequence would echo far beyond the Devonian itself. Coal seams beneath Pennsylvania, beneath Wales, beneath the Ruhr Valley of Germany, all originated from vast accumulations of ancient woody tissue laid down during the Carboniferous world that followed these first forests. The Industrial Revolution, hundreds of millions of years later, drew its energy from carbon captured by trees long vanished from the earth. Every steam engine crossing 19th century railways, every furnace heating iron foundries, every factory driving industrial expansion relied upon compressed remains of forests that had never properly decomposed. Ancient sunlight, stored within Devonian and Carboniferous wood, returned suddenly to the atmosphere through combustion after remaining buried for geological ages. In the late Devonian, however, the effect was still moving in the opposite direction. Living forests continued removing carbon dioxide from the air through photosynthesis, while dead forests refused to release that carbon after death. The atmosphere lost carbon continuously, yet almost none returned through decay. Earth's carbon cycle, the immense planetary exchange connecting atmosphere, ocean, rock, and living tissue, became profoundly unbalanced by this single evolutionary innovation. Carbon now moved overwhelmingly in one direction only, downward from the atmosphere into buried wood. The consequences extended across climate, ocean chemistry, and atmospheric composition simultaneously. Forest floors thickened with accumulating debris, while global carbon dioxide levels continued falling. Burial rates exceeded recycling rates by extraordinary margins. A process that had once operated as a circular exchange now resembled a trap, slowly locking carbon beneath sediment faster than natural systems could restore equilibrium. For tens of millions of years, Earth possessed forests producing a material almost nothing could consume. The imbalance persisted generation after generation, while trunks accumulated in wetlands, deltas, and lowland basins across the continents. Somewhere within that prolonged interval, evolution itself faced a growing pressure to respond. Organisms capable of unlocking lignin's chemistry had not yet appeared, and until they did, the buried carbon continued growing beneath the forests of the ancient world. In the Harz Mountains of Germany, there is a dark layer of shale once deposited beneath stagnant Devonian seas. Geologists named it Kellwasser after the nearby stream flowing through those hills, and within that black stone lies the record of one of the great dying intervals in Earth's history. Around 372 million years ago, the extinction reached its most destructive phase through two distinct pulses now known as the Lower and Upper Kellwasser events. Mass extinctions rarely unfold as a single instant of collapse. Ecosystems weaken gradually, recover partially, then fail again under renewed pressure. Each successive wave strikes organisms already diminished by the previous one. The late Devonian crisis followed that same pattern, spreading across oceans and coastlines in stages separated by roughly 100,000 years. The lower Kellwasser event concentrated its destruction primarily within shallow tropical seas. Reef systems suffered first. Stromatoporoid structures that had dominated warm continental shelves for tens of millions of years entered irreversible decline as oxygen-poor conditions expanded across coastal waters. Reef growth slowed, then ceased entirely in many regions. The water above them remained chemically unstable and increasingly hostile to organisms dependent upon clear, oxygen-rich environments. A relative pause followed, though not a true recovery. Ecosystems persisted in weakened forms across fragmented habitats. Then the Upper Kellwasser event arrived with greater severity and wider reach. The crisis spread beyond reefs into open ocean ecosystems, freshwater environments, and even the earliest terrestrial communities along river systems and floodplains. Marine food webs, already stressed by anoxia and climatic cooling, began collapsing across multiple levels simultaneously. Among the casualties were the placoderms, armored fish that had ruled Devonian seas for more than 70 million years. Some species grazed quietly along seafloors, while others occupied apex predatory roles comparable to later sharks. Entire evolutionary lineages vanished permanently during the Kellwasser interval. Tabulate and rugose corals, two major groups responsible for building ancient reef systems, suffered catastrophic losses from which they never recovered as dominant reef architects. Brachiopods, shell-bearing organisms that had covered seafloors since the Cambrian explosion, lost the majority of their species' diversity. Trilobites, already ancient by Devonian standards after surviving for more than 200 million years, experienced severe reductions across nearly all major groups. They endured beyond the Devonian, but never regained their former ecological dominance, fading gradually toward their final extinction during the later Permian catastrophe. By the end of the late Devonian extinction interval, approximately 75% of Earth's species had disappeared. In scale, the crisis rivaled the extinction that would eventually eliminate the non-avian dinosaurs hundreds of millions of years later. The pattern of survival revealed the mechanism behind the catastrophe with remarkable clarity. Shallow water tropical organisms suffered the highest losses, precisely where nutrient runoff and oxygen depletion were most intense. Deep ocean species survived at somewhat higher rates in regions less directly affected by coastal eutrophication. Freshwater organisms also endured more successfully in certain environments where local conditions remained variable and fragmented rather than globally stagnant. No convincing evidence points toward a single asteroid impact or immense volcanic eruption driving the Devonian collapse. The extinction emerged largely from biology itself, from forests altering atmospheric chemistry, nutrient cycles, and marine oxygen balance across the planet. Yet within those same stressed environments, certain organisms already carried traits that allowed them to endure conditions that destroyed so much surrounding life. Near the edges of the dying Devonian wetlands, certain fish began lingering where other animals struggled to remain alive. The water in these places was unstable, warm, shallow, and periodically depleted of oxygen. Many marine organisms could not endure such conditions for long, yet a small group of vertebrates possessed anatomical features that allowed them to tolerate environments others found lethal. These survivors belonged to the Sarcopterygians, the lobe-finned fishes. Unlike most fish, whose fins were supported mainly by thin rays, Sarcopterygians possessed muscular fins built around sturdy internal bones. Among them were creatures such as Eusthenopteron and, later, Tiktaalik, discovered in Arctic Canada in 2004 within rock layers dating to the late Devonian. Tiktaalik occupied a strange position between worlds. Its body still belonged largely to the water, covered in scales and equipped with fins rather than true limbs. Yet its anatomy already hinted at a future beyond the shoreline. Inside its front fins were bones directly homologous to those of the human arm, a humerus connected to structures equivalent to the radius and ulna. Those fins could support part of its body weight against soft sediment, allowing it to raise itself in shallow water or maneuver across submerged mud. Its skull detached from the shoulder girdle, forming a movable neck, something ordinary fish do not possess. Strong ribs reinforced its body cavity, helping support internal organs outside deep water while also assisting respiration. Most importantly, Tiktaalik could breathe atmospheric oxygen through primitive lungs, in addition to extracting oxygen through gills. In ordinary aquatic environments, such features provided only limited advantages. A fish living in well-oxygenated water had little need to gulp air or prop itself upward against mudbanks. During the Devonian crisis, however, coastal habitats increasingly shifted toward oxygen. Poor conditions produced by eutrophication and marine stagnation, shallow lagoons, estuaries, and floodplain waters became difficult places for conventional fish to survive. Within those unstable habitats, lungs ceased being secondary organs and became lifelines. Fins capable of limited support allowed movement through shallow pools where deeper swimming was impossible. Traits that once existed at the margins of usefulness suddenly determined survival itself. Natural selection intensified around those abilities generation after generation. The Devonian extinction, therefore, did more than remove competitors. It actively favored organisms capable of exploiting low oxygen environments along the boundary between water and land. Evolution accelerated toward forms increasingly adapted for brief excursions onto exposed surfaces and prolonged survival in shallow, fluctuating habitats. Near the transition between the Devonian and Carboniferous periods, the fossil record reveals the first true tetrapods, vertebrates with four limbs capable of sustained terrestrial movement. Acanthostega retained many aquatic features and even possessed 8 digits on each limb, while Ichthyostega carried a stronger skeleton better suited for movement across land, though it still remained closely tied to water for reproduction. Every land vertebrate alive tonight descends from survivors of those oxygen-depleted ecosystems. Frogs, reptiles, birds, mammals, and humans all trace their ancestry back to fish that endured the Devonian extinction because they could breathe where others suffocated and move where others became trapped. The forests had transformed the chemistry of oceans and altered the direction of vertebrate evolution itself. Across the continents, meanwhile, The land above the shorelines was also beginning to change into something far more biologically complex than anything Earth had known before. After the Devonian extinction receded, the continents did not remain quiet for long. Life expanded rapidly into the emptied spaces left behind by collapsing marine ecosystems and transformed shorelines. The Carboniferous period, beginning around 359 million years ago, became a world shaped increasingly by forests, wetlands, and dense atmospheric chemistry. Across vast lowland basins, vegetation thickened into ecosystems unlike anything that had existed before. The forests themselves changed form. Archaeopteris faded from dominance and gave way to taller, denser communities composed of giant lycopsids such as lepidodendron and sigillaria, scale-barked trees rising 40 to 50 meters above flooded ground. Enormous horsetails towered beside tree ferns, while early seed-bearing plants spread through drier environments beyond the swamps. The air beneath these forests carried a constant haze of moisture drifting upward from standing water and decaying vegetation. For tens of millions of years, dead wood continued, accumulating faster than Earth could recycle it. Fallen trunks settled into oxygen, poor wetlands where decomposition remained slow and incomplete. Sediment buried layer after layer of organic material beneath river deltas and coastal plains. Carbon that once circulated freely through atmosphere and biosphere instead became trapped underground in extraordinary quantities. The atmosphere responded dramatically. Carbon dioxide concentrations continued declining from earlier Devonian levels, though the rate eventually stabilized somewhat as ecosystems adjusted to the new balance. Oxygen, meanwhile, climbed to levels no modern human has ever experienced. During portions of the Carboniferous, atmospheric oxygen likely approached 35% compared to roughly 21% today. That difference altered the physical behavior of the planet itself. Fire ignited more easily in oxygen-rich air and burned with far greater intensity. Materials resistant to combustion under modern conditions could sustain flame during the Carboniferous. Coal deposits from this period contain widespread charcoal layers preserved between seams of compressed vegetation, evidence of immense wildfires ignited by lightning and spreading through saturated forests under oxygen-heavy skies. The elevated oxygen also transformed animal size. Invertebrates depend largely upon passive diffusion to transport oxygen through their bodies rather than pumping it actively through closed circulatory systems. Under modern atmospheric conditions, diffusion limits how large most arthropods can become before internal tissues fail to receive enough oxygen. In the Carboniferous atmosphere, that limitation relaxed dramatically. Dragonflies, such as Meganeura, reached wingspans approaching 70 centimeters and hunted above swamp forests like living gliders. Arthropleura, an armored relative of millipedes, stretched nearly 2.5 meters in length while moving through wet undergrowth on dozens of segmented legs. Giant scorpions prowled river margins beside amphibians large enough to resemble modern crocodiles, resting among the vegetation. By this period, the land itself had become ecologically richer and more structurally complex than the oceans. Forest canopies, wetland systems, freshwater channels, soils, fungal networks, and expanding terrestrial animal communities produced interactions denser than anything marine ecosystems had previously achieved. For most of Earth's earlier history, the sea contained the planet's deepest biological complexity. The Carboniferous reversed that pattern. Yet, the stability of this world depended upon a fragile chemical imbalance continuing indefinitely. Buried wood still accumulated beneath the swamps faster than decomposers could dismantle it, and the atmosphere above remained shaped by that unresolved interruption in Earth's carbon cycle. For tens of millions of years, forests continued producing a substance the living world could barely dismantle. Trunks accumulated in wetlands, branches vanished beneath sediment, and enormous reservoirs of carbon settled slowly into the crust of the earth. The imbalance persisted through generation after generation of expanding forests, while atmospheric oxygen remained unusually high and buried carbon continued growing beneath the continents. Then, evolution assembled a solution inside the hidden tissues of fungi. Among the basidiomycetes, a group of fungi still common in forests today, certain lineages evolved an enzymatic system capable of attacking lignin directly. These organisms became known as white rot fungi because of the pale, fibrous remains they leave behind after consuming wood. Unlike earlier decomposers, they possessed biochemical tools specifically adapted for dismantling the chaotic structure of lignin itself. The process depended upon enzymes called lignin peroxidases, manganese peroxidases, and lacases. Rather than cutting wood apart through simple digestion, these enzymes generated highly reactive oxygen radicals that attacked lignin's irregular molecular bonds from multiple directions at once. It was less like ordinary decomposition and more like controlled oxidative erosion unfolding through microscopic chemistry. As lignin weakened, the rigid, dark structure binding wood together dissolved away, exposing the softer cellulose beneath. Fallen trunks transformed gradually into pale, spongy masses threaded with fungal filaments. The white, stringy decay visible on rotting logs in forests today is the continuation of that same ancient biochemical process, still operating quietly after hundreds of millions of years. In 2012, a study published in the journal Science by Dimitri Flutis and colleagues compared the genomes of 31 fungal species and traced the origin of white rot fungi to approximately 290 to 300 million years ago, near the end of the Carboniferous period. The timing aligned remarkably closely with the decline of large-scale coal formation across the geological record. The connection was not accidental. Once fungi evolved the ability to decompose lignin efficiently, dead wood no longer accumulated indefinitely beneath forests. Carbon stored within trunks and branches returned once more to the atmosphere through decomposition rather than remaining trapped underground for geological ages. The interrupted carbon cycle slowly began closing again after remaining destabilized for roughly 60 million years. Atmospheric chemistry responded gradually. Oxygen concentrations moderated from their carboniferous extremes as decomposition resumed, returning carbon dioxide into circulation. Forest ecosystems became more balanced systems of growth and decay rather than one-directional carbon traps, steadily burying organic material beneath wetlands and floodplains. The timescale itself remains extraordinary. A single molecular innovation inside trees had altered planetary chemistry for tens of millions of years before evolution finally produced organisms capable of reversing its effects. Entire ecosystems, atmospheric conditions, and patterns of carbon burial shifted globally because decomposers required immense spans of evolutionary experimentation to overcome lignin structure. Today, white rot fungi remain among the most important organisms on Earth despite rarely attracting attention. Without them, modern forests would rapidly begin accumulating undecomposed wood across the landscape. Carbon burial would intensify again, atmospheric oxygen would slowly rise, and ecosystems would drift back toward conditions resembling the Carboniferous world. Instead, forests became dynamic systems where death fed new growth continuously. Fallen trunks returned their carbon to air and soil, allowing the planetary balance between atmosphere and life to stabilize once more. With that balance restored, the forests entering the next geological ages began changing in another profound direction, producing trees increasingly recognizable to the modern world. Long before flowers appeared, before fruits hung from branches or pine cones opened in winter air, another quiet invention altered the direction of life on land. Wood had allowed plants to rise upward, but height alone did not guarantee freedom. Reproduction still tied forests closely to moisture, riverbanks, floodplains, and wetlands, where delicate reproductive cells could survive long enough to begin new growth. Archaeopteris reproduced through spores, releasing microscopic cells into the air in enormous numbers. Each spore carried almost nothing with it beyond genetic instructions, wrapped in a thin protective wall. If it landed on dry ground, it died. If temperatures shifted too severely, it died. If moisture disappeared before germination began, the process ended there. Entire forests remained constrained by the constant availability of water. Then evolution produced something profoundly different. A seed was not a single cell drifting unprotected through uncertain conditions. It was a compact multicellular structure containing a dormant embryo, a reserve of stored nutrients called endosperm, and a durable outer coat capable of shielding the organism within from drought, cold, heat, and time itself. In practical terms, it functioned almost like a portable life support system, carrying both the next generation and the resources needed to survive difficult conditions before growth began. The earliest seed plants, called pteridosperms or seed ferns, emerged roughly between 360 and 385 million years ago during the final age of Archaeopteris. Their leaves still resembled ferns, but hidden within their reproductive biology was a transformation that expanded the boundaries of terrestrial life dramatically. Alongside the seed came another innovation equally important: pollen. Male reproductive cells no longer depended upon water to swim toward female tissues. Instead, they traveled through air itself, carried by wind across forests, valleys, and continental interiors, far beyond the reach of standing water. Reproduction detached from rivers and wetlands and entered the atmosphere. Together, seed and pollen removed the final biological tether connecting plants to permanently wet environments. Forests could now establish themselves across seasonal landscapes where drought arrived for months at a time. Mountain slopes, upland plateaus, and deep continental interiors became accessible in ways earlier vegetation could never achieve. The available territory for forests expanded enormously. What had once been scattered green corridors along water systems evolved into continental ecosystems spanning immense distances across the supercontinents. The Earth's surface darkened with vegetation as seed-bearing plants advanced into regions previously dominated by exposed rock and open sediment plains. The transformation mirrored another evolutionary shift unfolding among animals during roughly the same geological interval. Just as the amniotic egg allowed vertebrates to reproduce away from water, the seed granted plants the same independence. Both innovations formed part of a broader migration of complex life outward from the oceans and into the instability of dry land. During the Carboniferous, the first true conifers appeared, early relatives of modern pines, firs, and spruces. By the Permian period, these trees had spread through the interiors of vast continental masses where seasonal dryness would have made Archaeopteris reproduction impossible. Forests no longer followed water alone. They occupied climates shaped by frost, distance, and fluctuating rainfall. As these seed bearing forests expanded, the land itself became increasingly intricate, threaded together by biological relationships extending beneath the surface. The visible forest above ground rested upon another living structure hidden entirely within the soil, older than trees themselves and almost impossibly vast in scale. Beneath every forest, below the roots and stones and layers of fallen leaves, another structure spreads silently through the soil. It has no trunk, no branches, and no visible canopy, yet its total length can exceed the distance between cities within a single patch of healthy ground. Long before trees learned to rise into the air, this hidden system was already threading itself through rock and sediment, preparing the land for the organisms that would later dominate it. These organisms are mycorrhizal fungi, fungi that live in intimate partnership with plant roots. Their relationship with land plants stretches back at least 450 million years, older than forests themselves. The first plants attempting to survive on barren continents likely depended upon them from the beginning, because the early land surface offered little accessible nutrition beyond mineral-locked stone. The exchange between fungus and plant is remarkably balanced. Through photosynthesis, plants manufacture sugars using sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. Some portion of those sugars flows downward into the soil and enters fungal tissues attached to the roots. In return, the fungus extracts phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, and trace minerals from surrounding rock and soil, transferring them back into the plant that feeds it. The fungal structures responsible for this are called hyphae, microscopic filaments measured in micrometers rather than millimeters. They are vastly thinner than roots and capable of penetrating tiny fractures and pores within soil particles and rock surfaces inaccessible to plants alone. A single teaspoon of healthy forest soil may contain kilometers of these threads woven invisibly through the earth. Through those filaments, nutrients move continuously beneath the forest floor. Carbon fixed by one tree can travel into fungal networks and appear within neighboring trees days later. Nitrogen and phosphorus drift through the same underground pathways. A forest is not merely a collection of separate organisms standing beside one another. In many practical ways, it behaves more like an interconnected biological system, sharing resources across space. Research by forest ecologist Suzanne Simard demonstrated that large, established trees, which she termed mother trees, transfer measurable quantities of nutrients through these fungal networks into nearby seedlings. Some of those seedlings belong to entirely different species, yet their survival improves through connections maintained beneath the soil. Older trees effectively stabilize younger generations through relationships invisible from the surface. The network also carries chemical information. When insects begin feeding upon one tree, defensive compounds produced within damaged tissues can trigger biochemical responses in neighboring plants connected through the fungal web. Before insects physically arrive, nearby trees may already begin altering leaf chemistry and defensive behavior in preparation. The distinction between individual organisms grows difficult to define within such systems. A tree's roots merge physiologically with fungal tissue. Nutrients move between species. Chemical signals pass through shared pathways. Carbon captured from sunlight in one canopy may become part of another organism entirely. This hidden architecture was already present in the forests of Archaeopteris nearly 385 million years ago. While the visible landscape of the Devonian remained comparatively simple, the underground systems beneath those forests had already achieved extraordinary biological sophistication. Countless microscopic exchanges unfolded continuously below the surface, while the earliest tree canopies spread across the continents above. The forest overhead tells only part of the story. Beneath the soil, another forest exists entirely in darkness, woven from living threads that have accompanied trees since the beginning of life on land. Beneath the forests of the modern world lies a substance so ordinary that it is often overlooked entirely. It clings to roots, darkens after rain, and breaks softly apart between fingers, yet it is one of the most biologically active materials on Earth. Before the first trees appeared, almost none of it existed. The early continental surface was covered mainly by regolith, loose fragments of crushed rock spread across barren terrain beneath thin microbial films. There was no deep organic layer, no stable underground structure, and no living matrix capable of holding moisture for long periods. Water moved quickly across exposed surfaces, carrying sediment away almost as fast as weathering produced it. True soil required several ingredients operating together over immense spans of time. Mineral particles had to exist in many sizes, from coarse grains to microscopic clays. Organic material from dead organisms had to accumulate among those minerals. A living community then had to process both continuously, transforming loose sediment into a structured biological environment. Archaeopteris helped create all three at once. Its roots fractured rock into finer particles, while associated fungi extracted nutrients from mineral surfaces deep underground. Above the surface, fallen fronds, bark, and dead wood accumulated in volumes unknown in earlier landscapes. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and tiny detritivores moved into that debris and began processing it chemically, building the first stable forest soils. As those processes continued, distinct layers developed beneath the surface. The uppermost was the O-horizon, composed largely of decaying organic matter, fungal tissue, and partially decomposed plant material. Beneath it formed the A-horizon, darker mineral soil enriched with organic carbon and dense with roots and microorganisms. Deeper still were the B and C horizons, zones of partially weathered rock altered gradually through chemistry, water movement, and biological activity. This layered structure transformed the behavior of the land itself. Soil retained rainfall like a reservoir, moderated temperature around roots, stabilized landscapes against erosion, and stored nutrients that could be recycled repeatedly through living systems. Forests no longer depended entirely upon bare mineral surfaces. They now stood upon a growing biological foundation created partly from their own remains. The amount of life within that foundation is difficult to visualize. A single gram of healthy forest topsoil may contain roughly 1 billion bacteria, several meters of fungal hyphae, thousands of protozoa, and hundreds of microscopic nematode worms. Countless additional organisms occupy the spaces between mineral particles, feeding, reproducing, decomposing, and reshaping the soil continuously. Yet the process remains extraordinarily slow. Under forest conditions, forming 1 centimeter of mature topsoil may require between 500 and 1,000 years. The deep soils beneath temperate forests therefore represent millions of years of uninterrupted accumulation. In a real sense, the first Devonian forests never stopped building them. Every modern forest still contributes to that ancient process tonight. Roots continue breaking stone apart, grain by grain, while fungi move nutrients through darkness beneath the surface. There is also an unsettling symmetry hidden within the story. The same weathering and nutrient release that created fertile terrestrial soil also carried phosphorus into rivers and coastal waters during the Devonian, destabilizing marine ecosystems far away from the forests themselves. The trees had transformed the ground beneath them into a living system, and they were beginning to alter water with equal power and complexity. Each morning, in a mature forest, immense quantities of water begin rising invisibly into the air. Sunlight warms the leaves. Microscopic pores open across their surfaces, and water pulled upward from the soil escapes as vapor. A single large oak tree can release roughly 400 liters of water into the atmosphere within one day. Across a hectare of dense forest, the total reaches several million liters drifting skyward continuously from the canopy. That vapor does not vanish. It cools as it rises, condenses into clouds, and eventually falls again as rain, often far inland from the coast where the moisture originally entered the atmosphere. Forests do not merely endure rainfall, they participate directly in manufacturing it. This process, called transpiration, forms part of a broader idea known as the biotic pump hypothesis, developed by Russian physicists Anastasia Makarieva and Viktor Gorshkov. According to this model, large forests actively influence atmospheric circulation by maintaining enormous upward flows of water vapor. As vapor condenses into rain, air pressure shifts in ways that help draw additional moist air inland from the oceans. Without extensive forests, this inland transport weakens dramatically. Moisture arriving from the sea falls mainly near coastlines and fails to penetrate deeply into continental interiors. Over time, interior regions dry, rainfall declines further, and the climate shifts toward aridity. The forest and the rain become inseparable components of the same system. The modern Amazon rainforest demonstrates this process on a planetary scale. Roughly half of the Amazon's rainfall originates from the forest itself rather than directly from the Atlantic Ocean. Moist air moves westward across the continent, enters the canopy, falls as rain, rises again through transpiration, and repeats the cycle multiple times before eventually reaching the Andes. Atmospheric rivers of vapor move above the forest while countless biological pumps operate below. The Devonian forests likely transformed continental climates through similar mechanisms. As Archaeopteris spread inland along rivers and floodplains, transpiration would have increased atmospheric moisture across regions previously dominated by exposed sediment and sparse vegetation. Areas that once lost rainfall quickly back into rivers and evaporation began retaining water within growing ecosystems. The forests were not simply adapting to climate conditions already present, they were gradually constructing new climatic conditions that favored additional forest expansion. Rain supported further vegetation growth, which increased transpiration, which generated more rainfall across broader regions. The feedback loop reinforced itself continuously. That process helps explain how Archaeopteris forests spread across continental lowlands with such geological speed. Once established in one region, forests altered local humidity, moderated temperatures, and increased precipitation in surrounding areas, making nearby environments more suitable for continued expansion. The same physics still applies to modern forests. Remove large-scale vegetation from a continent, and the rainfall associated with it declines as well. The atmosphere above cleared land behaves differently from the atmosphere above living forest. Moisture pathways weaken, clouds form less reliably, and dry conditions intensify over time. Long before animals filled the terrestrial world, forests were already regulating atmospheric moisture at continental scales. They reshaped weather patterns, redirected water through the air, and influenced where rain would fall across the Earth's surface. All of this was unfolding while the ground beneath those canopies remained comparatively empty of large terrestrial life. The forests had already become engines of climate, chemistry, and geology before most animals had even begun moving across the soil below them. At ground level beneath the Carboniferous forests, the world remained dim even during the day. Dense canopies filtered sunlight into scattered green shafts that reached a floor layered with damp vegetation, fallen bark, fungal mats, and slowly decomposing wood. For the first time in Earth's history, enormous quantities of organic material accumulated continuously across the land surface, creating habitats stable enough to support entire ecosystems hidden below the trees. The earliest organisms to flourish there were decomposers and detritivores, creatures that consumed dead organic matter and the microorganisms growing upon it. Primitive mites moved through moist debris alongside collembolans, tiny springtails that fed on fungal tissue and decaying plant material. Myriapods, early relatives of centipedes and millipedes, threaded their segmented bodies through layers of leaf litter accumulating across the forest floor. These organisms were older than forests themselves. Their ancestors already existed on sparse pre-forest landscapes, surviving among microbial crusts and isolated patches of vegetation. The difference now was scale. The Carboniferous forests supplied resources in immense and predictable quantities. Organic matter no longer appeared in scattered fragments across bare rock. It covered entire landscapes continuously, season after season. Within this environment, the first true insects diversified. Early wingless hexapods, resembling modern silverfish, fed among fungal networks and decomposing debris beneath the canopy. The forest floor provided shelter from drying conditions, stable humidity, and a constant supply of food generated by the expanding vegetation above. Around 325 million years ago, winged insects began appearing in the fossil record. Their emergence transformed terrestrial ecosystems permanently. One leading explanation for the evolution of wings connects directly to the structure of forests themselves. Before trees, the land offered little vertical complexity. Forests created a layered world of trunks, branches, canopies, and suspended food sources extending upward through the air. Wings allowed insects to navigate that three-dimensional environment efficiently. Flight provided access to elevated surfaces, improved movement between feeding sites, and offered rapid escape from predators moving through dense undergrowth. Reproduction also changed, as flying insects could locate mates across larger distances within the expanding forests. Along the edges of wetlands and shallow pools, descendants of Devonian tetrapods began occupying damp, terrestrial habitats beneath the trees. Early amphibians moved through shaded margins where standing water met thick vegetation. Their bodies still depended heavily upon moisture, but the forest created exactly the humid conditions they required. The soundscape of those forests would have been unlike anything alive today. No birds moved through the canopy. No mammals rustled through leaves. Frog calls had not yet entered the night air. Instead, there were softer sounds, the steady drip of condensed moisture falling from towering vegetation, the scrape of segmented limbs through debris, the dry clicks of enormous insects moving among roots and fallen trunks. Somewhere within the undergrowth, Arthropleura, armored and several meters long, pushed slowly through layers of decaying vegetation. The forests were not merely occupying the continents, they were manufacturing ecological opportunities faster than evolution could fully exploit them. Every new layer of habitat produced additional specialization. Organisms adapted to bark surfaces, fungal mats, canopy leaves, wet hollows, decomposing wood, and shallow pools beneath the trees. The branching complexity of terrestrial life accelerated with each expansion of the forest itself. By the Permian period, the ecological richness of the land had surpassed that of the oceans, yet the forests, supporting that complexity, were approaching another planetary crisis of their own. Across the immense interior of the supercontinent Pangaea, the forests had changed again. The damp coal swamps of earlier ages retreated from many regions, replaced by tougher vegetation adapted to harsher seasons and drier air. Conifers lifted narrow crowns above broad valleys, their seeds protected within resilient shells that could endure heat and distance. Seed ferns spread beside them, strange plants with fern-like leaves but reproductive systems no longer tied to standing water. The continents, once edged by scattered green corridors, had become deeply terrestrial worlds, biologically elaborate far from the sea. Animals followed that expansion inland. Reptiles diversified into forms suited for deserts, floodplains, and upland forests where seasonal droughts would have killed their amphibian ancestors. Among them were the therapsids, creatures that already carried faint anatomical hints of the mammals, still far in the future. Their teeth had begun specializing into incisors, canines, and grinding molars rather than remaining rows of identical points. Their limbs angled more directly beneath the body, allowing movement less sprawling and more efficient across long distances. Some paleontologists suspect that several groups had begun experimenting with elevated metabolism, generating internal heat rather than relying entirely on the sun. In the cooling evenings of the Permian interior, warm blood may already have flickered quietly within their bodies. For tens of millions of years, this world endured, until the boundary at approximately 252 million years ago, when Earth entered the greatest biological collapse its surface has ever recorded. The event is known simply as the Great Dying. In the oceans, approximately 96% of marine species disappeared. On land, roughly 70% of species vanished. Entire branches of the tree of life ended in geological silence. Unlike the Devonian catastrophe, this extinction did not begin with roots breaking stone or forests draining carbon from the sky. Its source rose from beneath the crust itself. In what is now Siberia, volcanic eruptions erupted across an area larger than modern Western Europe. Layer upon layer of basalt flooded outward in pulses that continued for hundreds of thousands of years. These eruptions formed the Siberian Traps, one of the largest volcanic provinces in Earth's history. The eruptions released extraordinary volumes of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Global temperatures climbed by approximately 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. Oceans warmed, circulation weakened, and oxygen levels fell again. Seawater absorbed carbon dioxide and became more acidic, making shell formation increasingly difficult for marine organisms already stressed by heat. Forests withered under unstable climates, while shallow seas lost the chemical balance that complex ecosystems required. The contrast with the Devonian extinction remains one of the deepest symmetries in Earth history. The Devonian crisis emerged from biology, reshaping climate through cooling, oxygen shifts, and nutrient flooding. The Permian crisis emerged from geology, overwhelming the atmosphere with volcanic greenhouse gases. One catastrophe pulled heat from the world, the other trapped it. Both transformed the planet with comparable force. Most therapsid groups disappeared during the Great Dying, yet a few endured through the devastation. In the emptied ecosystems that followed, Their descendants slowly diversified again, carrying forward the anatomical experiments that would eventually become fur, milk, and the first true mammals. The world rebuilding after the Permian would belong to reptiles on a scale never seen before, and the forests rising beside them were beginning to resemble forests familiar to modern eyes. The forests that emerged after the Permian extinction belonged to survivors. Across the recovering continents, conifers spread through climates still unstable from the greatest biological collapse Earth had ever experienced. Their seeds endured drought, heat, and seasonal extremes more effectively than the older swamp vegetation of the Carboniferous. Pines, fir relatives, cypresses, and towering Araucarian conifers rooted themselves across valleys and uplands while animal life slowly rebuilt around them. By the Triassic and Jurassic periods, these conifer forests dominated most of the terrestrial world. Their trunks rose in dense stands beneath humid skies where reptiles moved through broad floodplains and volcanic highlands. Cycads spread beneath the canopy, thick-bodied seed plants crowned with rigid leaves that resembled palms despite belonging to a far older lineage. Wet lowlands supported immense tree ferns whose fronds arched outward in layered green shadows, yet this world still lacked many features now associated with forests. No grasses covered open ground. No flowering plants brightened the understory. No deciduous trees shed leaves across seasonal landscapes. The Jurassic world was green, but in a manner distant from modern forests, ancient in both structure and atmosphere. For more than 100 million years, conifers remained the dominant trees on Earth. Then, during the Cretaceous period beginning approximately 145 million years ago, another evolutionary transformation unfolded. Around 130 million years ago, flowering plants first appeared in the fossil record. Their early forms were modest, scattered among existing forests, but they diversified with astonishing speed. Within 20 to 30 million years, flowering plants expanded into tens of thousands of species, occupying wetlands, riverbanks, uplands, and forest interiors across multiple continents. Charles Darwin later described their sudden diversification as an abominable mystery. The key to their success lay in a new partnership between plants and insects. Flowers functioned as biological signals, using color, scent, nectar, and shape to attract pollinators with remarkable precision. Instead of relying primarily on wind to scatter pollen randomly through the air, flowering plants recruited insects to transport pollen directly between individuals of the same species. That partnership reshaped evolution itself. Flowers specialized for certain pollinators, while pollinators evolved bodies and behaviors increasingly adapted to particular flowers. Some insects developed feeding structures suited only to narrow floral shapes. Some plants timed blooming cycles around the activity patterns of specific pollinators. Each adaptation encouraged another. Both groups diversified together, branching into new forms at extraordinary speed. By the end of the Cretaceous, flowering plants had displaced conifers across many environments, especially in warm and temperate lowlands. Forests became denser and more structurally varied. Angiosperms also evolved the deciduous strategy, shedding leaves during cold or dry seasons to conserve resources. This adaptation allowed trees to thrive in climates where evergreen conifers remained less competitive. Yet even these increasingly familiar forests rested upon foundations established hundreds of millions of years earlier. The soils, nourishing flowering trees, the fungal networks beneath them, the oxygen-rich atmosphere surrounding them, and the climate systems carrying rainfall inland, all traced back to the first forests of the Devonian. By the time flowering trees spread across Earth, trees had already shaped the planet for so long that their influence had become almost impossible to notice, woven quietly into the structure of the world itself. Long before the impact itself, the forests of the late Cretaceous had become dense with flowering trees. Magnolias, early relatives of walnuts and sycamores, and broadleaf canopies spread across warm continents where dinosaurs moved through layered vegetation, evolved for browsing, fruiting, and rapid seasonal growth. Insects pollinated flowers overhead, while mammals, no larger than rats, sheltered beneath roots and fallen leaves. The forests had become intricate biological architectures, filled with fruits, seeds, shade, and vertical habitats accumulated through hundreds of millions of years of plant evolution. Then, approximately 66 million years ago, a mountain of rock arrived from space. The Chicxulub impactor, roughly 10 kilometers wide, struck the shallow seas of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The collision released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons within seconds. Bedrock vaporized. Shockwaves traveled through the crust and atmosphere simultaneously. Molten ejecta blasted upward beyond the atmosphere, then fell back across the planet as incandescent debris. As that material re-entered the atmosphere, the sky itself began radiating heat. Forests ignited continent by continent. Dry vegetation burst into flame beneath a rain of glowing particles, while pressure waves flattened ecosystems far from the impact site. Soot and pulverized rock climbed into the upper atmosphere, where they spread around the globe and blocked sunlight for months, possibly years. The collapse that followed was not only an extinction of animals, it was a planetary interruption of photosynthesis. Trees that had evolved under stable cycles of sunlight suddenly faced darkness severe enough to halt growth across much of the earth. Leaves withered. Food chains dependent on living vegetation unraveled from the bottom upward. The geological record preserves this moment with extraordinary clarity. At the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods, the diverse pollen signatures of flowering forests disappear abruptly in many regions, replaced by overwhelming quantities of fern spores. Paleontologists call this pattern the fern spike. Ferns specialize in disturbed ground. They spread rapidly across landscapes stripped bare by fire, flood, or volcanic eruption. Their spores drift easily through damaged ecosystems where larger plants struggle to recover. That narrow layer of fern spores marks one of the most sudden ecological resets in Earth history, the moment when much of the global forest canopy died nearly simultaneously. Not all trees vanished. Species with large, nutrient-rich seeds possessed reserves capable of sustaining seedlings through prolonged darkness. Some trees survived through deep root systems, able to resprout after fires passed overhead. Others endured because their seeds remained dormant in soil until sunlight returned. Forest survival became less about height or dominance and more about endurance. The mammals that persisted through those years shared similar advantages. Small bodies required less food. Warm-blooded metabolisms functioned through unstable climates. Many could survive on seeds, insects, roots, and decaying organic matter, while larger ecosystems collapsed around them. When sunlight gradually returned and forests regrew, mammals expanded into ecological spaces left vacant by the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. Flowering trees formed the framework of that recovery. Fruits, branches, and layered canopies became habitats for increasingly agile mammals that climbed, grasped, and navigated three-dimensional forest spaces. Among them were the earliest primates, creatures whose evolution became inseparable from trees long before humans existed. Long after the forest survived asteroid fire and planetary darkness, small mammals began moving through the recovering canopy in ways no reptile ever had. They climbed with grasping fingers instead of claws alone, balancing along branches where flowering trees spread fruits, insects, and shelter through layered vegetation. From those forest mammals emerged the first primates approximately 55 to 65 million years ago, delicate arboreal creatures whose bodies were shaped almost entirely by the geometry of trees. The canopy demanded precision. A misjudged leap between branches meant injury or death several meters below. Forward facing eyes evolved within that vertical world because depth perception mattered more there than speed across open ground. Stereoscopic vision allowed the brain to compare slightly different images from each eye and calculate distance accurately enough to grasp a branch in motion. The same visual system later guided stone tools, architecture, astronomy, and written language, but its origins belong to creatures navigating leaves in dim forest light. The hand followed a similar path. Opposable thumbs, flexible wrists, and dense sensory nerve endings developed first as climbing adaptations. Branches vary constantly in thickness, texture, and stability. A primate moving safely through a canopy required delicate control and continuous tactile feedback. The precision grip that would eventually carve tools and write symbols began as a mechanism for holding bark. Even the path toward upright walking appears tied more closely to woodland than open grassland. The Australopithecines, among the closest early relatives of humans, lived in mosaic environments where patches of forest merged with expanding savannas across Africa. Fossil evidence increasingly suggests that bipedalism emerged while these hominins still depended heavily on wooded habitats. Walking upright may have helped them move through tangled undergrowth, carry food between scattered tree clusters, and reach fruit hanging from lower branches. Before humans crossed plains efficiently, they were creatures of broken forests learning to navigate changing landscapes. Wood shaped human behavior long before metal or stone transformed civilization. Early humans used branches for digging, defense, shelter frames, and fuel. Most wooden tools vanished from the archaeological record because wood decays easily, yet its absence from fossils hides how central it was to survival. Fire itself depended upon forests. Charcoal, produced through the controlled burning of wood in low oxygen conditions, burns hotter and more steadily than raw timber. Without charcoal, copper could not be smelted efficiently. Neither could iron. Entire technological eras rested upon the slow growth of trees. The dependence deepened as societies expanded. Ships carrying trade, migration, warfare, and exploration across oceans were constructed almost entirely from timber until the 19th century. Medieval cities consumed surrounding forests for beams, roofs, carts, fences, and fuel. Cathedrals that appear immortal in stone were held upright internally by massive wooden frameworks hidden beneath their roofs. Paper emerged from pulped wood fibers. Agricultural expansion cleared forests, even while relying on wooden plows, handles, barrels, wheels, and homes. Human civilization often appears separate from forests in hindsight, as though cities replaced trees rather than emerging from them. Yet nearly every stage of human development remained physically rooted in ancient plant chemistry and ancient plant structure. The forests shaped the primate body first, then supplied the materials that carried civilization forward. Beneath every wooden ship, every charcoal furnace, and every sheet of paper rested a quieter inheritance still, one carried invisibly through the atmosphere and into every human breath. Air can feel permanent because it surrounds every living moment so completely. It presses softly against oceans and mountains, fills valleys during the night, moves through forests before dawn, and enters the lungs without effort thousands of times each day. Yet the atmosphere of Earth is not fixed. Its chemistry has shifted continuously across planetary history, altered by volcanoes, oceans, microbes, fungi, and above all, by the long labor of living organisms turning sunlight into matter. The oxygen concentration of the modern atmosphere, approximately 21%, is not an original feature of Earth. Early in the planet's history, free oxygen was almost entirely absent. The rise of oxygen began with photosynthetic microbes in ancient seas, but forests transformed that process on an entirely different scale. The Devonian trees and the vast Carboniferous forests that followed removed extraordinary amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere while releasing oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. Wood burial and coal formation allowed oxygen to accumulate because carbon that would normally recombine with oxygen remained trapped underground instead. For a period during the Carboniferous, oxygen levels climbed to roughly 35% of the atmosphere. Wildfires burned intensely across entire continents, and insects reached dimensions impossible under modern atmospheric conditions. That imbalance, eventually moderated after fungi, evolved the biochemical machinery necessary to decompose lignin efficiently, returning buried carbon to circulation. Since then, atmospheric oxygen has fluctuated but stabilized around the modern baseline through a long equilibrium between photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, weathering, and burial. Scientists reconstruct those ancient atmospheres through delicate chemical traces preserved across immense spans of time. Air bubbles, trapped inside polar ice cores, preserve direct samples of prehistoric atmospheres reaching back hundreds of thousands of years. Older oxygen histories are inferred through isotope ratios locked within sedimentary rocks and ancient soils. Different isotopes participate slightly differently in biological and geological reactions, leaving signatures that reveal broad shifts in atmospheric chemistry through deep time. Those records show that oxygen concentrations have risen and fallen repeatedly, often in close relationship with the expansion or collapse of forests. Even the nitrogen dominating the atmosphere carries biological fingerprints. Roughly 78% of every breath consists of nitrogen gas, a molecule most organisms cannot use directly. Specialized bacteria living within soils convert atmospheric nitrogen into biologically accessible compounds through nitrogen fixation. Forest ecosystems support enormous communities of these microbes, particularly around root systems and fungal networks, where organic matter and minerals circulate continuously beneath the ground. Carbon dioxide tells another part of the same story. Tonight, the atmosphere contains more than 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide, a concentration shaped by billions of years of volcanism, rock weathering, ocean chemistry, biological carbon burial, and now industrial fossil fuel combustion. The coal, oil, and natural gas being burned by human civilization originated largely from ancient biological carbon stored across geological ages, including forests whose chemistry began in the Devonian world. Every breath drawn tonight contains oxygen produced through the same fundamental reaction that operated inside Archaeopteris hundreds of millions of years ago. Trees still split water molecules using sunlight, release oxygen into the atmosphere, and bind carbon into living tissue through precisely the same physics and chemistry. The forests outside continue running an ancient planetary process without pause, quietly maintaining conditions that complex animal life depends upon with every breath it takes. Long before human cities, before mammals, before flowers opened beneath sunlight, the planet experienced another moment when life altered the chemistry of Earth faster than ecosystems could comfortably absorb. The Devonian forests did not arrive gradually in the geological sense. Once lignified trees and deep root systems appeared together, the atmosphere, oceans, soils, and climate began shifting in ways that had no earlier precedent. A biological invention had entered the carbon cycle with enough force to reshape the planet. Those first forests removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at extraordinary scale. Carbon locked into wood, buried beneath sediment, and carried into coal deposits no longer circulated freely through air and ocean. Deep roots accelerated mineral weathering and phosphorus release, destabilizing marine chemistry and feeding immense blooms in coastal waters. Temperatures fell as greenhouse gases declined. Ice accumulated in regions that had remained unfrozen for hundreds of millions of years. Ocean circulation changed. Reef systems collapsed beneath oxygen, depleted seas. Today, the direction of the disturbance is reversed, but the pattern itself carries an unsettling familiarity. Another biological innovation, industrial combustion, powered largely by buried carboniferous carbon, is altering atmospheric chemistry with exceptional speed. Instead of withdrawing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, human civilization is returning ancient carbon to circulation through coal, oil, and natural gas combustion. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations are rising rapidly, global temperatures are increasing, and ocean chemistry is shifting once again. The similarity lies not in identical mechanisms, but in the structure of the disruption itself. In both cases, organisms evolved or developed a new way of interacting with carbon at planetary scale. In both cases, systems that had remained comparatively stable across immense spans of time began changing rapidly enough to overwhelm ecological adjustment. Rate matters profoundly in Earth history. Geological records repeatedly show that ecosystems can adapt to slow transformations unfolding across millions of years. Species migrate, evolve, or reorganize as climates drift gradually. Rapid change is different. The late Devonian carbon dioxide decline unfolded across roughly 10 to 15 million years, astonishingly fast by geological standards. The modern atmospheric increase has occurred across centuries. Measured against deep time, the present shift resembles a sudden chemical shock. The oceans already carry visible signatures of this transition. Carbon dioxide dissolving into seawater forms carbonic acid, lowering oceanic pH and reducing the availability of carbonate ions required by corals and many shell-forming organisms. Modern coral reefs are experiencing measurable declines in calcification under warming and acidifying conditions. The chemistry differs from the Devonian anoxic crises, yet there is a recognizable echo in the vulnerability of reef ecosystems during rapid carbon cycle disruption. Extinction rates today are estimated to be tens to hundreds of times above long-term geological background levels, with some estimates reaching even higher. Habitat fragmentation, warming climates, invasive species, pollution, and acidifying oceans are compressing evolutionary response times across countless ecosystems simultaneously. The Devonian comparison remains imperfect and should remain so. The starting atmospheres differed, the biological communities differed, and the mechanisms operated in opposite directions. Yet the underlying principle remains visible across both worlds, life altering the carbon cycle quickly enough to destabilize the broader systems that support it. The Devonian forests were not choosing to transform the planet. They followed the quiet logic of evolution and chemistry alone. Trees spread because trees that spread survived. Roots deepened because deeper roots gathered more water and minerals. Nothing in those forests understood the global consequences unfolding around them. For hundreds of millions of years, life transformed the planet without intention. Roots fractured stone, forests thickened the atmosphere with oxygen, fungi rewired the carbon cycle beneath fallen trunks. Reef systems rose and vanished, ice advanced and retreated across continents. Every shift emerged from organisms pursuing survival through local, immediate interactions, never through foresight. The Devonian forests altered oceans they could not see and climates they could not comprehend. Archaeopteris possessed no awareness of the world beyond the reach of its own tissues. It had no nervous system to gather information, no memory, no capacity to imagine consequences unfolding thousands of kilometers away. Its roots dissolved rock because chemical pathways that dissolved rock improved access to minerals. Its wood accumulated carbon because lignin resisted decay. Each individual tree followed the quiet logic written into its biology, and together, those countless trees changed atmospheric chemistry, ocean circulation, extinction patterns, and the future trajectory of life itself. The catastrophe that followed was not chosen. No forest intended the collapse of reefs or the suffocation of shallow seas. The extinction emerged from scale, from millions of organisms collectively altering planetary systems faster than those systems could stabilize. Earth history is filled with such moments. Cyanobacteria oxygenated the atmosphere long before oxygen-breathing animals existed. Land plants transformed weathering rates long before vertebrates walked beneath their canopies. Evolution repeatedly reshaped the planet through consequences no organism could perceive while causing them. Humans occupy a strange position within that history. We remain biological organisms shaped by evolution, constrained by metabolism, competition, and inheritance like every lineage before us. Yet we are also the first species capable of observing the planetary consequences of collective behavior while those consequences are unfolding. Carbon dioxide can be measured directly from Antarctic ice cores, satellite observations, tree rings, coral skeletons, and atmospheric monitoring stations. Ocean temperatures, extinction rates, glacial retreat, and chemical changes in seawater can be modeled mathematically and observed across decades. No earlier organism possessed that capacity. The Carboniferous forests did not understand atmospheric oxygen concentrations climbing toward 35%. The white rot fungi that restored decomposition to forests did not perceive themselves stabilizing planetary chemistry. Even the asteroid that ended the Cretaceous acted without intention, following orbital mechanics alone through silent space. The ability to perceive Earth as a connected system is itself an outcome of the ancient evolutionary chain those first forests helped create. Trees altered atmospheric oxygen, stabilized soils, and expanded terrestrial ecosystems. Those ecosystems supported tetrapods, whose descendants diversified into reptiles, mammals, and primates. Arboreal primates evolved stereoscopic vision and grasping hands in forest canopies. Larger primate brains emerged through long ecological pressures unfolding across millions of years. Eventually, one branch developed symbolic language, scientific reasoning, and the capacity to reconstruct the story of worlds that vanished before mammals existed. In that sense, the first forests produced something entirely unprecedented. From lignified trunks and Devonian root systems emerged, through an unbroken chain of inheritance, organisms capable of understanding the carbon cycle they inhabit. We are made from the consequences of those forests, chemically, evolutionarily, and historically. And within that realization rests a condition no earlier species ever possessed: the ability to recognize what is happening while it is happening, and to decide whether knowledge itself changes the outcome. At first glance, a tree seems easy to define. A trunk rises from the ground, branches divide outward, leaves gather sunlight overhead, and roots disappear beneath the soil. The organism appears self-contained, separate from the world around it, in the same way an animal appears separate from air or stone. Forests seem composed of countless neighboring individuals, standing side by side, each beginning and ending at the surface of its bark. Yet nearly every layer of modern biology dissolves that boundary the closer it is examined. Beneath the soil, the roots of a tree are threaded with mycorrhizal fungi, so intimately connected to plant tissue that separation would destroy both partners. The fungal filaments penetrate the outer root cells directly, forming structures through which minerals, water, sugars, and chemical signals move continuously between plant and fungus. The tree cannot gather phosphorus efficiently without the fungal network. The fungus cannot survive without the sugars produced by photosynthesis in the canopy above. Neither organism functions properly alone in the environments where forests exist naturally. The root zone surrounding a tree contains astonishing biological density. Thousands of bacterial species occupy microscopic films around soil particles and root hairs. Some convert atmospheric nitrogen into biologically usable compounds. Others dissolve minerals locked inside rock grains. Some produce antibiotics that suppress pathogenic fungi and bacteria before they can damage root tissue. The chemistry sustaining a forest is carried out not by isolated trees, but by immense microbial communities operating continuously beneath the ground. Even the leaves overhead are inhabited. Endophytic fungi live inside leaf tissues without harming the tree, altering defensive chemistry, drought tolerance, and growth patterns. Entire microscopic ecosystems exist within the surfaces and internal spaces of bark, needles, stems, and roots. What appears to be a single organism is, biologically speaking, a layered consortium assembled from thousands of cooperating lineages. This becomes stranger still in certain forests, where the distinction between one tree and another begins to disappear entirely. In the Wasatch Mountains of Utah stands a colony of quaking aspens known as Pando. What appears from above to be a forest of separate trees is genetically one individual connected through a shared underground root system. Approximately 47,000 trunks rise from that single network, spread across 43 hectares and weighing an estimated 6 million kilograms. Some stems die while others emerge, yet the organism itself persists beneath them, replacing its visible structures the way a coral reef replaces polyps or a human body replaces cells. Its age remains uncertain because the root system renews itself continuously, but estimates range from 80,000 years to perhaps 1 million years. Pando may have already existed while mammoths crossed Ice Age grasslands beneath colder skies. Once such systems are acknowledged, the idea of individuality becomes difficult to hold with certainty. If carbon moves between neighboring trees through fungal networks, if warning signals travel underground before insects arrive, if nutrients pass from older trees into younger ones across species boundaries, then the forest behaves less like a crowd of isolated organisms and more like a distributed living system. The first forests were already operating this way. Beneath the Archaeopteris canopies, ancient fungal networks connected roots through the same exchanges of chemistry and information still running through forests tonight. Outside every window, where branches move quietly against the dark, that system continues, ancient beyond memory, spread through wood, fungi, soil, bacteria, rainwater, and air as though the forest itself never truly ended at the bark at all. Somewhere beyond the walls tonight, a tree is standing in darkness. Perhaps its branches are moving slightly in evening wind, or perhaps the air around it is still enough that every leaf remains motionless against the sky. It may be an oak spreading heavy limbs over a street, a pine lifting narrow needles into cold air, a birch pale against rain, or a palm holding fan shaped leaves beneath humid clouds. Whatever form it takes, the chemistry inside it belongs to an ancient inheritance that reaches back nearly 385 million years. Its trunk is reinforced by lignin, the same irregular carbon polymer that allowed the first forests to rise above the ground in the Devonian world. That molecule still stiffens cell walls, strengthens wood against gravity, and stores atmospheric carbon inside living tissue. The coal seams later burned in furnaces, locomotives, and power stations were built from that same biochemical innovation. Every modern tree still carries it, unchanged in its essential function across spans of time almost too large to imagine comfortably. Beneath the surface, unseen roots are pressing gradually through mineral fractures and microscopic pores in stone. Their tips release carbonic acid and other compounds into surrounding rock, dissolving minerals atom by atom and drawing phosphorus, calcium, potassium, and magnesium upward into the vascular system. The process unfolds silently and continuously, just as it did beneath Archaeopteris forests, long before mammals existed. Around those roots, fungal networks remain active in darkness. Mycorrhizal hyphae are threading through soil particles narrower than grains of sand, exchanging minerals for sugars produced during daylight hours. Carbon fixed from the atmosphere earlier in the day is already moving underground through fungal tissue toward organisms the tree itself can never directly see. Neighboring plants remain connected through these exchanges, linked by chemistry flowing through the soil beneath streets, forests, gardens, and fields. Inside the trunk, another archive is quietly accumulating. Each growth ring records the conditions of a single year, wet seasons and dry seasons, warmth and cold, abundance and stress. Tree ring science, dendrochronology, has allowed researchers to reconstruct climate records extending roughly 12,000 years into the past through preserved wood recovered from riverbeds, peat deposits, and ancient structures. Narrow rings speak of drought. Wider rings preserve years of moisture and longer growing seasons. Atmospheric chemistry itself leaves subtle isotopic signatures in the wood. Even now, in darkness, the tree remains hydraulically active. Sunlight no longer drives photosynthesis, and oxygen production has paused until dawn returns, yet water is still moving upward through xylem tissue. Root pressure and the cohesion tension mechanism continue lifting columns of water against gravity through microscopic vascular tubes. In tall trees, that movement can extend more than 100 meters above the ground without mechanical pumps, relying entirely on the physical properties of water molecules pulling against one another in continuous chains. Nothing about the process is new. The tree outside tonight is performing versions of the same exchanges that transformed the Devonian atmosphere, built soils across continents, altered rivers, shaped climates, and helped create the evolutionary conditions from which vertebrates, mammals, primates, and eventually humans emerged. And before sunrise reaches its leaves again, it will still be standing there quietly, moving water, storing carbon, feeding fungi, and continuing a planetary process that began long before any animal ever opened eyes beneath a forest canopy. Imagine the history of Earth compressed into a single calendar year. Midnight on January 1st marks the formation of the planet from dust and collisions orbiting a young Sunday. Oceans condense from steam beneath volcanic skies. Continents harden slowly from molten crust. By late February, the first life appears in the sea, microscopic and fragile, drifting through waters without fish, shells, or forests. For most of that imagined year, the land remains silent stone. Complex animals do not emerge until November. The first plants creep onto shore only in the final weeks of the calendar, spreading thin green films across wet margins beside rivers and tidal flats. Then, near the evening of November 24th, forests arrive. Archaeopteris raises woody trunks into the air, roots descend into fractured rock, and the chemistry of the atmosphere begins changing with unexpected speed. By November 25th, the Devonian extinction is unfolding through the oceans. Entire reef systems disappear within less than a single day of the compressed year. The coal seams formed afterward accumulate over approximately 6 days. Forest after forest grows, falls, and sinks beneath sediment while continents drift and mountain ranges rise. Carbon remains buried through spans of time so large they exceed ordinary imagination. Humans eventually extract and burn much of that carbon in roughly 1.5 seconds before midnight on December 31st. Dinosaurs appear on December 13th. They dominate Earth for less than 2 weeks before vanishing on December 26th beneath the aftermath of the Chicxulub impact. Mammals spread afterward into forests already ancient beyond comprehension. Primates arrive late on the final evening of the year. All of recorded human history occupies approximately the last 11 seconds before midnight. The Devonian black shale layers preserving the Kellwasser extinction still exist beneath Germany, Morocco, New York, and Australia. Geologists recognize them immediately. Dark bands recording depleted oxygen, disrupted carbon cycling, and biological collapse. They are not symbolic reminders. They are physical evidence written directly into stone by a planet reacting to rapid change. Something equivalent will remain from the present era as well. Far in the future, after coastlines have shifted and modern cities have weathered into sediment, a distinct layer will persist in the rocks. Carbon isotope ratios will reveal abrupt atmospheric alteration. Fossil sequences will show a sudden acceleration of extinction rates. Plastics, concrete fragments, industrial metals, synthetic chemicals, and radioactive residues will remain embedded within the strata. The geological record will preserve unmistakable evidence that a species altered planetary chemistry within an extraordinarily brief interval. What feels immense within a human lifetime becomes almost impossibly thin against deep time. Yet deep time does not erase consequence. The Devonian forests transformed Earth permanently. The Carboniferous oxygen surge transformed it again. The asteroid at the end of the Cretaceous redirected the future of vertebrate life. The present moment belongs to that same continuity of planetary transition. What distinguishes this interval is not merely the scale of the change, but the presence of awareness within it. For the first time in Earth's history, the organisms participating in a planetary transformation can observe it while it unfolds, reconstruct its mechanisms, compare it against ancient analogs, and imagine outcomes before those outcomes fully arrive. The immensity of geological time does not diminish the present. It frames it quietly, placing tonight within a continuum older than forests, older than animals, older than oxygen itself. Long before forests darkened riverbanks, before animals walked on land, before even the first shell formed beneath an ancient sea, sunlight was already being folded into living matter by microscopic cells drifting through the oceans. The chemistry was simple in principle and immeasurably vast in consequence. Photons struck pigments, water molecules split apart, oxygen escaped into the surrounding world, while carbon dioxide became sugar, and sugar became life. That process is still running tonight. Every tree, standing beneath the night sky, is performing the same fundamental sequence. Archaeopteris performed 385 million years ago. In daylight, water rises from the soil through microscopic tubes thinner than thread. Carbon dioxide enters through pores in the leaves. Sunlight drives electrons through chains of proteins assembled with astonishing precision. Oxygen is released invisibly into the atmosphere. Carbon becomes wood. The chemistry has endured for approximately 2.7 billion years. Ice ages arrived and retreated around it. Continents broke apart and collided again. Entire mountain ranges rose from seabeds and later eroded into plains, while photosynthesis continued without interruption. Asteroids struck the planet. Volcanoes flooded continents with lava. Oceans lost oxygen and regained it. Forests expanded across the world, vanished in catastrophe, and returned in altered forms. Through all of it, the transfer of light into living tissue continued from one generation to the next without ever fully stopping. The continuity becomes difficult to hold in the mind because it exceeds ordinary scales of memory. A forest is not merely a collection of trees growing at the same moment. It is part of an unbroken biological inheritance, stretching backward through millions upon millions of seasons. Each tree grows from the remains of earlier forests. Each layer of soil contains compressed fragments of leaves, roots, fungal filaments, and buried wood from organisms long vanished. Every ring added to a trunk becomes part of a structure built gradually across centuries by sunlight stored 1 year at a time. The Devonian extinction altered the direction of life profoundly, yet even that crisis did not interrupt the deeper process beneath it. The reefs collapsed, ancient fish disappeared. Ocean chemistry shifted toward darkness and stagnation. Still, forests persisted. The carbon cycle bent into a new form rather than ending. Mycorrhizal networks continued threading through the soil. Seeds evolved. New tree lineages spread across the continents. The chemistry endured, while the living architecture surrounding it changed again and again. Recovery after catastrophe has never meant returning to an earlier condition. Earth does not rewind, it reorganizes. The forests following the Devonian were unlike the forests before it, yet they drew carbon from the air through the same photosynthetic machinery. The forests after the asteroid impact differed from those of the dinosaurs, yet the same sugars flowed through trunks and roots beneath newly opened skies. There is something quietly stabilizing in recognizing that continuity. The systems sustaining complex life are older than forests, older than vertebrates, older than almost every visible feature of the modern world. They belong not to any single species, but to the deeper logic connecting light, water, rock, and air across geological time. The first trees nearly ended the world as it had been. Then the world continued, and the forests kept growing. Tonight, without noticing it, every living thing on land is participating in systems older than forests themselves. The oxygen entering the lungs with each quiet breath was released by photosynthesis, the same ancient chemistry that Archaeopteris performed beside Devonian rivers 385 million years ago. Sunlight struck pigments, water molecules split apart, oxygen drifted free, and carbon became living tissue. The mechanism has persisted continuously through extinctions, continental rearrangements, volcanic winters, and asteroid impacts. Every forest alive now is another expression of that uninterrupted chain. The carbon inside the human body has moved through that chain repeatedly. At some point in the distant past, every carbon atom in muscle, skin, bone, or blood existed as atmospheric carbon dioxide. Plants drew it from the air and assembled it into sugars. Animals consumed the plants or consumed other animals. Organisms died, decomposed, and returned their carbon to soil, ocean, or atmosphere before the cycle began again. The pathways are unimaginably tangled, yet they belong to the same planetary circulation the first forests transformed. Beneath modern forests, the soil itself remains part of a process begun when roots first penetrated bare stone. Before trees, continents were covered largely by fractured mineral surfaces and thin microbial films. Now the ground holds layered ecosystems of bacteria, fungi, decaying organic matter, insects, roots, and buried carbon extending downward through dark horizons built grain by grain across immense spans of time. Every temperate woodland and tropical rainforest rests upon inheritance accumulated since the Devonian. The fungal networks threading through that soil are descendants of the alliances that allowed plants to conquer land in the first place. Hyphae continue moving phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon between roots in silence beneath every forest floor. The partnership between fungus and tree has survived longer than dinosaurs, mammals, flowers, or birds. It predates wood itself. Every tetrapod alive today also carries Devonian history within its anatomy. Amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals descend from lobe-finned fish that survived oxygen-poor waters by breathing air and pushing themselves through shallow environments with strengthened fins. The bones inside the human arm still preserve that structure. Humerus, radius, ulna, wrist, and fingers trace backward through mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and ancient fish toward the same evolutionary bottleneck created when forests destabilized marine ecosystems. The Industrial Revolution was powered largely by forests that never rotted. Coal seams beneath Pennsylvania, Wales, China, and the Ruhr Valley formed from buried Carboniferous wood compressed beneath sediment for hundreds of millions of years. Steam engines, furnaces, railways, and electrical grids were fueled by sunlight, captured in prehistoric trunks long before mammals existed. Even petroleum connects back to this story. Much of the oil burned in engines originated as marine organisms buried in sediments after ancient ecological collapses. Some portion of that carbon passed through oceans transformed by the Devonian extinction, preserved underground until extracted by a species descended from the survivors of that same event. The hand resting against a blanket tonight, capable of writing, carving, grasping, and building, was shaped first for movement through branches. Opposable thumbs, flexible wrists, depth perception, and sensitive fingertips evolved in forest canopies created by descendants of the earliest trees. None of these connections are metaphorical. They are chemical, anatomical, geological, and continuous. We are living inside the aftermath of the first forests still. Somewhere tonight, beyond roads and apartment lights and sleeping cities, a tree is quietly adding another ring beneath its bark. The layer is impossibly thin, narrower than a fingernail clipping, assembled cell by cell from water, lifted out of the ground, and carbon drawn invisibly from the air. No movement can be seen from a distance. The trunk appears motionless beneath the dark, yet inside, living tissue continues dividing with patient precision. That ring already contains the signature of this year. Its width reflects rainfall and drought, warmth and cold, abundance and stress. The chemistry sealed into its cells records atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations unique to this moment in planetary history. Isotopes embedded in the wood preserve traces of storms, seasons, sunlight, and soil moisture. Long after the surrounding leaves have fallen and entire human generations have passed away, that narrow band may remain preserved inside the trunk as a quiet archive of a single year on Earth. The tree does not know it is creating a record. It does not hold memory or intention in the human sense. No thought accompanies the process. Water rises upward through microscopic conduits because cohesion between molecules allows continuous columns to remain intact. Sugars move through living tissues toward roots, bark, buds, and wood because concentration gradients and cellular pumps direct them there. Growth emerges from chemistry, following physics through structures refined by evolution across immense spans of time. And yet, the continuity of that process reaches backward farther than almost any story humans tell. Tonight's ring belongs to the same biological inheritance that once raised Archaeopteris above bare Devonian stone. The same lignin strengthens its wood. The same photosynthetic machinery captures light from the sunday. The same exchange persists underground as fungal networks trade minerals for carbon in darkness beneath the roots. The same slow conversation continues between rock, water, atmosphere, and living tissue, uninterrupted across 385 million years. Forests have survived ice sheets advancing across continents, volcanic winters dimming the sky, asteroid impacts igniting global firestorms, and extinctions that erased most species on Earth. The forms changed. Ancient lineages vanished. New ecosystems emerged from ruin. Still, the deeper processes endured, ring following, ring through ages too vast for ordinary memory. The story of the first trees never truly concluded. It expanded. It exists now in mangrove swamps breathing with the tides, in conifers rooted against alpine wind, in tropical canopies releasing water vapor into afternoon clouds, and in solitary trees standing beside quiet streets beneath electrical wires. Every forest alive tonight is another chapter added to a continuity older than mammals, older than flowers, older than the shape of the modern continents. Among the consequences of that continuity was the eventual appearance of nervous systems capable of reflection. Forests altered oceans, atmospheres, climates, and evolutionary pathways long before any organism could perceive the scale of those transformations. Eventually, through chains of survival and adaptation extending back toward Devonian shorelines, there emerged a species able to wonder about the process while remaining inside it. The wondering belongs to the story as much as the wood itself. Outside, trees continue their work without urgency. Roots remain threaded through the soil. Water still climbs through xylem beneath the bark. Another microscopic layer of growth settles quietly into place. By morning, the ring will be slightly thicker than it was tonight.